with a podcast called Nightmares on the Lost Highway, every now and then, we delve into topics that maybe aren't so much monsters and ghosts, but are related. And again, when you're called Nightmares on the Lost Highway, there's one man in the history of America that I would think is probably responsible for more nightmares than just about any other person.
Bill Weirs.
No, not me.
Oh,
I don't think so.
Okay.
Before I even read a single book or even maybe saw a single movie inspired by the works of Stephen King, I can say I know he gave me nightmares. My mom didn't filter the things I was exposed to. My mom explained the book It to me as she was reading it, and the idea of a terrifying clown living in the
sewer systems,
eating children. I had never.
What's not to love?
I didn't read a Stephen King book. I don't know if I'd seen a Stephen King movie, and I was still terrified of Stephen King. And of course, It was probably one of the first Stephen King books I ever read. And I read a thing the other day that said with Stephen King fans, usually what happened to get you involved is you read a Stephen King book at much too early an age, and it scarred you for life. I know I read The Stand when I was maybe a freshman in high school, which is much too young to read anything Stephen King related, to be honest. But a lot of people do start reading Stephen King in high school. I considered it one of my first grown-up reads, and that's a very long book, and there's a lot of stuff in there.
Yeah, I was going to say, not only for the content, but the pages of content.
1,100 pages.
You've got to be committed to some degree to pick up a book, a tome like that.
And honestly, I just reread it not that long ago. I've talked about it before. I'm kind of going back through and rereading Stephen King. And so Stephen King was fresh on my mind, and maybe it's not everybody's cup of tea. I know a lot of people tune in for monsters and ghosts and murderers, but Stephen King talks about all those things and more. And, definitely influential for me in pushing me down the path to the things I'm interested in. And Eric and I were talking before we started. I'm a reader. I read a lot. That's even how I do my research for the podcast, Eric.
I'm a research reader, but not so much as like a novel reader. Yeah. I'm more of a video type person, movie, TV.
Yeah, I was going to say, I know when we talk about our research, you usually tend to watch more videos than I do.
Yes.
Or documentaries, whatever.
Yes.
Appropriate. Yes. So we are going to talk about someone who's inspired plenty of nightmares.
The man.
One of my favorite authors.
The myth.
Stephen King.
The legend.
From a child born into this world, we are taught what to believe. Closed-minded we become, fearful to be deceived. Still we desire to know what lies beyond that locked door. The art of the storyteller, conjuring tales of legend and lore. History hidden, lost knowledge, things forgotten and the unknown. These are the things that direct us and will set the tone. Welcome, friends, to another episode of Nightmares on the Lost Highway.
So to give a brief overview, if you're unfamiliar with Stephen King, and I do want to preface this episode with spoiler warning. We are going to talk about a lot of Stephen King works, and there may be some spoilers. So I'm going to talk, I think we reference It. We talk about Dark Tower stuff. We make references. Obviously, if you're going to talk about Stephen King, you're going to talk about the stuff he wrote. So there will be some spoilers for some Stephen King stuff here. And with a man who's published over 70 books, I don't expect anyone's read them all. I'm sure there are plenty of people out there, what Stephen King calls the constant reader. I'm sure they have read almost everything Stephen King had. I remember seeing a hardcover of The Stand on my grandma's bookshelf before I was old enough to know
what it even
who
was.
He was, what it was. So, but he's published over 70 books, including over 50 novels. More than 30 of those have become #1 bestsellers, and many have become cultural icons. I mean, when you talk about Pennywise the Dancing Clown, everybody knows who Pennywise is. I think if you reference Cujo, almost everybody knows who Cujo is. The pig's blood scene in Carrie, or, here's Johnny.
Christine, the haunted car. Yeah.
I mean, everybody, it's like Star Wars. Everybody kind of knows who Darth Vader is. If everybody has a Stephen King reference tucked away somewhere in their mind. In addition to the novels, he has over 235 writing credits, and there are 58 film and television adaptations of his work. And his work encompasses everything from horror, drama, fantasy to crime thriller and science fiction. He's sold over 350 million copies of his books worldwide. And again, movies, television shows, comic books. And if it wasn't for Stephen King has inspired so many people to be creative and to do these things. I mean, you wouldn't have the modern classic Stranger Things if it wasn't for Stephen King.
Yeah.
When I watched the first episode, that's what I told my wife. I said, this is everything I love. It captures like the nostalgia of the 80s, and it is so much like Stephen King. So, like, you wouldn't have a lot of the inspiration, a lot of the things that we have today, at least in the world of horror especially. But even with horror, Stephen King sees himself, as transcending horror. Like I said, crime, thriller, science fiction, fantasy, drama.
He actually he felt kind of shoved in the corner as being the king of horror, literally. And he fought to kind of get out of that because to that same point, he's offered a lot of that same stuff, like you said, to crime, murder, sci-fi, the other writings. He's inspired other authors, movie directors. I mean, the list goes on and on and on.
Now, what really kind of drove me to do this episode is much like our Cthulhu episode where we talked about Cthulhu and the Cthulhu mythos, and then we drifted into talking about H.P. Lovecraft as a person. Stephen King's books, before you had the MCU, before you had these shared universes, King had created over 40, 50 years this universe where a lot of his books call back to one another, and ultimately they all sort of tie into the Dark Tower series. Stephen King sees it as a world where, the world of the Dark Tower is sort of the core of this universe he's created. So I wanted to touch on that a little bit, just talk about his universe. A lot of characters will cross over. They belong to different timelines. For example, the entity known as It, personified as Pennywise the Dancing Clown, played amazingly by Bill Skarsgård, and back in the 80s by none other than Tim Curry, who also did a fantastic job. But this is a monster that appears every 27 years in the town of Derry, Maine, taking the form of people's greatest fears. It, or Pennywise, exists both in the Dark Tower universe as well as what I'm going to refer to as our universe, but the real world, the world we exist in. The Man in Black, Randall Flagg, the primary villain of The Stand. He exists in the universe of The Stand, as well as the story The Eyes of the Dragon, which is sort of a fantasy story written by King. King feels that he's actually one of his best villains, and he takes various forms throughout what the fans refer to as the macroverse, this larger King universe. All the horrors and monsters that exist in this macroverse, especially like those seen in The Mist, which is one of my favorite movies. And when I first read The Mist, it's the only book, it's not really a book, novella, but it's the only thing I ever read through and then immediately reread. Like, as soon as I finished it, I flipped back to page 1 and reread it again.
To try to get a better comprehension and understanding.
I've read The Mist multiple times. I've seen the movie.
The movie freaked me out.
The movie is, it's amazing.
And I think with Stephen King, a lot of that is, it's not so overdone. It doesn't have to be blood splatter and all this. It's what you don't see that is more frightening often than what anybody could dream up to make up in prosthetics or whatever for a movie to see.
And the other aspect of King and the horror that comes with King is the fact that the characters are relatable. They let's stick with The Mist for a moment. The characters in that grocery store, like those people. You know
can relate to
like
them.
You've seen those people.
That reminds me of so and so, and that's so and so.
Well, the guy when he shoots the Mrs. Carmody, and he's shaking. Like, you don't just take a human life and not feel anything.
Right.
And you could see that affected him. Or, the main guy who just wanted to take care of his kid and get him to safety. Those people, like that. And that's the other thing with King. When you read King books or you watch King movies, and I'll be honest, I don't think it comes across quite as well in movies, because movies are sort of a different genre, a different medium.
And they're almost always altered from the book to some degree for time restrictions or whatever.
But those characters are for the most part believable. They're just everyday people usually that are caught in these crazy circumstances. But like with The Mist, those monsters, they come from the macroverse, or the way King has labeled it, Todash space, which is this realm where the monsters come from. Now the macroverse and Todash space, depending, they're either connected or even possibly the same. But that's where monsters come from.
Now you mentioned the tie over basically with Stranger Things. I just had a flashback there when the Demogorgon is basically coming in, and they're like in a supermarket or a shopping mall or something.
Something like the mall. Yeah,
it's very I mean, a head nod to Stephen King's work with The Mist. I mean, very much so.
Stranger Things, again, when I first watched it, that was my first thing I told my wife. This is so much like Stephen King. And we love it in my house. We watch it, and I can't wait for the 5th season. I know it's the last one, but
I know it's so interesting too, because like with King stuff, as you're watching that, and again, I'm not a reader. You guys can throw eggs at me or whatever. I'm not an avid reader of novels. Again, I read books and books and books on research and history, but it's a different kind. But it's trying to figure out, as you're either reading the novels or the pages, or you're trying to interpret what you're seeing on TV. Is this alien? Is it paranormal? Is it demonic? Is it what is about to happen? What is causing this? And so even if you think you've got a gist on what the story is going to be, you still don't know the origins until you're well drug into the story.
And that's the thing, again, with Stephen King. And like you said earlier, sometimes in horror, it's more about what you don't reveal. The Mist is a perfect example of, like, no one really knows what happened.
What lies in the mist.
What's in the mist. I mean, even in the book, there are so many creatures described, which, I'm a monster guy. So that's every 5 pages of that story, there's another monster there. And it's like, could you imagine? Like, it's crazy. But, and again, not only are there shared people and entities, but, there's also another common theme is that of the Shop, which is a secret government organization that's involved in many of these horrors. Depending on what you read, and it's possible that they are the ones that tapped into Todash space with the Arrowhead Project, which released The Mist that we talked about. They experimented with a chemical called Lot 6, which caused unwitting test subjects to develop psychic abilities in the story Firestarter.
Mm-hmm.
They are even referenced in The Stand, where a secret government agency created a horrific virus that wiped out like 99% of humanity. So now, while others exist in their own timelines, a lot of things, they all exist as part of the larger macroverse. Even King, it's all the same world. Another feature of King's universe is the Shine. Of course, popularized by The Shining. But this is just, this fact that in a lot of King stories, some people have powers and abilities that are considered superhuman. If you want to go back to Stranger Things, which I think we can go back to quite a bit, 11 and her psychic powers. Now, some people, of course, have these powers. Carrie White has telekinesis in the story Carrie. Johnny Smith has the ability to see the future in The Dead Zone. Dick Halloran and Danny Torrance have psychic sensitivity in The Shining. Charlie McGee's pyrokinesis in Firestarter. Or even John Coffey's ability to heal other people in The Green Mile.
Like a weird estrangement of X-Men.
Yeah. Yeah, the craziest X-Men you've ever heard of. And of course, all of these kind of come together, like The Stand and Eyes of the Dragon, Salem's Lot, they all sort of reference each other in different areas. But all of these stories are part of King's much grander story, that of the Dark Tower. I think the Dark Tower is 7 or 8 books, and I think he's actually writing another book that ties into the Dark Tower right now, if I remember correctly. But the Dark Tower contains sort of the genesis story for the Stephen King universe, if you will. And so I'm going to read a little bit of that. In the beginning, there was the darkness behind everything, and it was called Prim. This was the primordial chaos from which everything arose. And from the darkness arose Gan, the creative force of the universe, and the 6 beams that are protected by 12 guardians. These 6 beams are the framework for the entire space-time continuum. Everything hinges on these beams. Now, Gan created everything that exists, including the Dark Tower itself, and the universe the Dark Tower exists in is the home of Roland Deschain, the gunslinger, which is the main hero of the Dark Tower series. Now, when I read the Dark Tower, I see in my mind Roland Deschain is, the man with no name from the old Clint Eastwood westerns.
Oh, yeah.
Now, I know he was played by Idris Elba in the Gunslinger movie, which, Idris Elba's a fantastic actor, but that's just, I see in my mind's eye, I see the old Clint Eastwood. But in the King universe, ultimately everything is connected to the Dark Tower. In King's own words from the afterword of Wizard and Glass, quote, "I have written enough novels and short stories to fill a solar system of the imagination, but Roland's story is my Jupiter, a planet that dwarfs all the others, a place of strange atmosphere, crazy landscape, and savage gravitational pull. Dwarfs the others, did I say? I think there's more to it than that, actually. I am coming to understand that Roland's world, or worlds, actually contains all the others of my making." So the Dark Tower encompasses all of King's works. He sees that as that big shared universe like we talked about. Now, again, the Dark Tower universe is just one universe. There are many, many universes, including the universe that includes Keystone Earth. Keystone Earth represents our world. It's the world that we live in. And it includes everything that you know, everything and everyone, as well as Stephen King himself, who was used by Gann to tell the story of the gunslinger. And that is chronicled in the Dark Tower series. As a matter of fact, I believe there's a part in one of the books where Roland actually meets Stephen King and doesn't know what to do next because Stephen King hasn't written that yet. So
nice little twist.
Yeah, it's an interesting little thing. Next, Stephen King began that Dark Tower series in 1970 and has worked on it continuously for over 40 years.
That's some dedication.
Over 50 years at this point, I guess.
Yeah.
You know, and it's just this amazing interconnected universe that Stephen's been working on. Much like I said, like the MCU, you know, you've got the movies and the comic books, and I was a fan of Marvel movies, but I was like the Marvel movies, like the Iron Man, the Avengers movies. And then, you know, if you've watched the latest ones, the old Spider-Man movies all tie in, and the old X-Men movies now and all that. So you've got this multiverse, and Stephen King's been doing that since the 60s.
Yeah, that Marvel can't claim that, or Disney can't claim that. That's all Stephen King.
But that's just a peek into the worlds of Stephen King. And of course, a man who has created this much for the world to enjoy, which again, I think everybody's got a Stephen King reference. Everybody's probably read a Stephen King book or seen a Stephen King movie. I mean, for such an interesting universe, I mean, really, Stephen King's a pretty unassuming kind of guy.
Yeah.
And to talk about his life, you know, you start way back, September 21st, 1947, Portland, Maine, as Stephen King was born. His father was a traveling vacuum salesman after World War II. And when Stephen King was very, very little, just 2 years old, his father left, leaving his mother, Nellie, to raise King and his brother by themselves.
Now, literally, that is the oldest story of the book. He's going out to get cigarettes and never comes back home.
Oh, I didn't find that.
Yes.
That is ridiculous.
And I'm like, wow, that is the stereotypical.
Very cliche.
Yes.
Well, the King family moved often. Sometimes they had very little money to get by. You know, when you talk about poverty, Stephen King and his family, they suffered. They knew what it was to have nothing. When King was 11, they moved to Durham, Maine, and they sort of settled in the Maine area at that point. Now, King himself says he started writing when he was about 6 or 7, and his interest in horror started when he was very young, since he liked the feeling of fear. He wanted to be scared. King published his first short story entitled I Was a Teenage Grave Robber. So that's a cool name. In 1965. He started at the University of Maine at Orono in 1966, and while there, he wrote for the student paper, he attended writing workshops, and he found mentors in Professors Edward Holmes and Burton Hatlin. It was also here where he met his future wife, Tabitha Spruce. He graduated with a bachelor's degree in English and a teaching certificate in 1970, and he and Tabitha were married in 1971.
I was doing some research and digging, as I do, and I often go way too deep. But had you come across anything about possibly him writing for a local newspaper back in 1959?
No.
Dave's Rag, as the title was. He had bought basically into this local newspaper, him and it was either a friend, I believe, or maybe a brother. Anyhow, they started writing this, and the area of the newspaper was called Dave's Rag. He had bought this type of a machine, and together they put together a paper that they sold for 5 cents an issue. And Stephen attended Lisburn High School in Lisburn up until 1962, collaborating with another best friend, Chris Chelsea, in 1963, and they started publishing other things. But can you imagine for the ultimate Stephen King collector to have some of those old newspapers? I mean, that would be really cool, I thought.
Yeah, you know, again, any of that old stuff, I have here, you know, he sold his first short story, The Glass Floor, to Startling Mystery Stories in 1967. You know, there's a lot of stuff in that back catalog of King's there. I was looking for a list of the works, so I wanted to read Stephen King's works in order. And there's a lot of short stories that even he has lost. Like he sent them to a publication and maybe it was his only copy or
never got it back.
Never got it back, and it never got published. So after he graduated in the fall, he began teaching high school English at Hampden Academy. He continued writing this whole time, hoping that a major paperback sale would provide him with the means to leave teaching and write full time. Now, during this time, and I do like the origin story of Carrie here, during this time, he started a short story that would become the novel Carrie, and it was sort of based on two ideas that he saw. One was the idea of the how cruel teenage girls could be to one another, especially
Amen.
when they were going through the changes that you go through with puberty. And also, he'd read an article that said psychic abilities, if you believe in such things, would manifest
during that
when
time
people
frame.
go through puberty.
Makes sense.
And so he took these two articles and he combined them, he smashed them together, if you will. So you have this story of Carrie White being bullied by, the other high school girls because, she's awkward and she's going through puberty. She doesn't understand what's going on.
And girls are just mean.
Yeah. And at the same time, she's developing this telekinesis ability that she can move things with her mind.
That she doesn't fully understand and trying to comprehend. And
so I guess he didn't feel it was coming together very well. He took it and he threw it away. Just threw it away. And if you can imagine pages of Carrie sitting in a trash can somewhere.
Oh yeah.
This volume of Stephen King work that is now a classic and all that.
Different but similar. I mean, I'm an artist. I love to do sculpting. I love to do drawing and stuff. And 90% of the stuff I start, I never finish because I just don't feel it's going down the path I want.
I like to pretend that I'm a writer, but I very rarely finish anything that I start when it comes to writing because you get so in your own head about things.
Yeah, yeah.
But anyway, his wife, Tabitha, she saw these pages on the top of the trash can and, it wasn't like Stephen, I guess, to throw away anything he was working on. So she started reading through it and it kind of spoke to her. So she came back, she went to Stephen and she gave him some advice, like some advice from the female perspective of what she went through and said, look, you need to flesh this out. This is
good.
Really good stuff here. And so he finished the story and Carrie was published in the spring of 1974 and the novel was turned into a film in 1976. So very quickly, Stephen King kind of made a name for himself, made a splash. After Carrie became a hit, King's star, of course, was on the rise. King was followed by Salem's Lot and then The Shining and then bestseller after bestseller after bestseller. However, for King, with fame, came other problems. Now, throughout the 80s, King struggled with addiction. He's been very open about that. He often wrote under the influence of cocaine and alcohol. One anecdote is that, he claims he barely even remembers writing Cujo, doesn't remember that time of his life. And I mean, I guess it just really just took over. He said that his drug addiction actually influenced the writing of the story Misery, which in Misery, a writer is involved in a car crash and then his number one fan finds him and
loved the
locks
movie
him up.
adaptation with Kathy Bates. Oh my gosh.
And in King's own words, and the woman, the number one fan, that's Annie Wilkes in the story. He said, quote, Annie was my drug problem. She was my number one fan. And God, she never wanted to leave. I mean, he admitted like he had problems. So shortly after this, his wife staged an intervention and he agreed to go get help. And of course, King went from bestseller to bestseller in the 90s, including 4 Past Midnight, Needful Things, The Green Mile, among others. And then in 1999, King almost loses his life.
Yes. I kind of picked up with this story and probably went way too deep with it. But again, I was trying to get into the psyche, the understand what makes this guy tick. I mean, because obviously he ticks for a lot of people. But in 1999, he was in a near-death car accident. Not probably what you might assume. He was severely injured in an accident. He was actually walking, some say jogging, alongside the highway, and he was hit by this van. Now, that left him in critical condition with injuries to his lungs. He had broken ribs, broken leg, fractured hip. I mean, really did a number on him. After 3 weeks of operations, he was finally released from the Central Maine Medical Center in Lewiston. Now, again, I dove down into this way deep, but perhaps there's more to this story than what the master of horror and writer and the creator might even be able to conjure up. But I wanted to take a deep dive into some of the facts of this almost tragic accident. And a good portion of this I found on an online Ranker article, amongst some other ones. But Stephen King's car accident seemed like a violent story literally ripped from the pages of one of his books.
Stephen King actually said, reflecting on the accident some years later, "It occurs to me that I have nearly been killed by a character out of one of my own novels. It's almost funny."
Amen, brother. It was so brutal, it almost killed him. The best-selling author was out for a walk. Again, some people say he was jogging near his home in 1999 when a distracted driver slammed into him with enough force to send King flying over the top of this van and into a ditch. He was very lucky to survive. But as I had said, he suffered multiple serious injuries. Now, who hit Stephen King, leaving him injured? Well, that would be a man by the name of Brian Smith, the driver of the van. And he kind of instantly became famous as the guy who almost killed Stephen King.
Use infamous, maybe.
Infamous. There's even a better word. Yeah, that's a better way to put it. Unwillingly becoming a part of the canon of Stephen King trivia. Now, charges were brought against Smith, and he made a heartfelt apology. But many accused King of abusing his celebrity status, if you will, in his treatment of Smith and to Smith during the court case. I don't get that. If this guy nearly kills you, I don't care who you are, you've got a right, to sue this guy and go after him in court.
You can be upset, but at the same time, I think, man, I'm the kind of guy that an accident is an accident. You know what I mean? Like I guess I've forgiven a lot of things that a lot of people probably wouldn't.
Well, I was there once with my near-death experience. We talked about that on another one. So I think I've maybe calloused a little bit to your point, but
yeah, I definitely understand if a man almost kills you with a car or a van, as the case may be. You definitely have the right to be upset with him.
Yeah, I mean, you would think. But now, the time Stephen King almost died has many strange details of one of his novels. In fact, this true Stephen King story has been adapted into several of his works to some point, little fragments, again, like the way he loves to do. So what happened to this guy who ran over Stephen King? And did Stephen King really buy that van that hit him? The answers to these questions, along with other strange details, will keep you on the edge of your seat as we dive in. Fact number one, he did purchase the van that hit him that day. It is a coincidence that Stephen King wrote about a demonic vehicle, Christine, before he himself had an evil vehicle experience himself. Probably. But to ensure any overly enthusiastic fans wouldn't pounce on the van as a souvenir, King decided to buy the 1985 Dodge Caravan that hit him from Brian Smith for $1,500.
Didn't he destroy it? Did he have it destroyed?
Yes, okay. And I'll get to that. He wanted to raise money for a charity by allowing people to beat the van up with like baseball bats and stuff in return for a small fee at this donation. But King's wife, Tabitha, talked him out of it and said, I don't think with the backlash you're already getting in your celebrity status that's going to help your case. So they literally just sent it to the junkyard and it was smashed. So it is no longer existent. Number two, the driver of that van dies on Stephen King's birthday. On September 21st, 2000, Brian Smith, the driver, passed away, and he was discovered in his trailer by his brother. Now, there was a Sheriff James Michelin. He said there he was, on his back in bed, covered up. He was just lying there like he'd went to sleep. Preliminary autopsy showed inconclusive results, and the cause of death was labeled as unknown. It was later discovered Smith died of most likely an overdose of painkillers. Now, on the same day, Stephen King turns 53 years old. Perhaps it is because of his birthday, but King became remorseful. And he commented, "Our lives came together in a very strange way. I'm grateful I didn't die. I'm sorry he's gone." Number three fact. Smith's driving record was as scary as one of Stephen King's novels. Brian Smith was not what anyone would consider a good driver. He had a previous conviction for driving under the influence. Once passing out on the lawn after running several cars off the road.
Wow.
I guess he made it home and just kind of parked it in the yard and fell asleep. Between 1989 and 1998, he was actually convicted 11 times for driving under the influence and speeding. His driver's license was suspended and restored 3 times in 1998 alone.
Wow.
How does this happen? Well, after the accident, King commented, "There isn't really anything that he's got that I want except for his license." Unfortunately, that's a piece of paper that seems to be very hard to get away from anybody in this state.
Well, apparently you can take it from him, but he just gets it back.
He just gets it right back. Now, according to Smith's driving record, King's statement is incredibly accurate on all of those facts. Number 4, Cujo. The brother had this dog that was somehow involved with this case. It's a weird coincidence that to Cujo, a dog, is at least partially, to blame for Stephen King's near-death accident. Brian Smith claimed he was distracted while driving with his dog, who was loose in the van. Now, Smith had 2 Rottweilers, one named Pistol, one named Bullet. Said this was really his only companions, his really only real friends. It kind of puts you in the psyche of the driver. Supposedly, Bullet was trying to get in a cooler full of beer, probably trying to get him a little drink.
Well, why not? I'm sure Brian had one.
Yeah, I'm leading by your example, Dad. So he was trying to stop the dog from getting probably his beer. He swerved off the road at the exact spot where Stephen happened to be walking. Now, after Smith's death, Pistol and Bullet were found next to his body, and they were placed in a shelter.
Wow. Fact
number 5. It's not what, but who you know. And Bill and I have talked about this on some other previous podcasts. Warren Silver, Stephen King's lawyer, pointed out some possible bad police work surrounding this Brian Smith, stating they should have impounded the vehicle. They should have tested him for drugs and alcohol at the scene, and they didn't do any of that. It's also interesting to note Matt Baker, the sheriff's deputy who responded to the accident, was once a member of Freiburg, a small town in Maine, Freiburg police, along with Everett Smith, and supposedly the only eyewitness that gave a statement was Matt Baker's Uncle Chip. So we might have a little family group of friends that stick close together and kind of cover, which might explain, if he had friends or family on the police force, why he kept getting that license returned back to him. Fact number 6. King wore the broken glasses from that day while riding. Brian Smith slammed into Stephen King so hard, the author's glasses flew off and were found in the front seat of Smith's van. I had mentioned it flipped him plumb over the top of this. Now, Smith believed he had hit a small deer until he saw the bloody frames there in the seat. As King himself said in his book on writing, Memoir of the Craft, the frames were bent and twisted, but the lenses were unbroken. They are the lenses I'm wearing now as I write this. King replaced the damaged frames, but decided to keep the lenses. I guess that I wanted to say that things that were ordinarily, you would see as quite fragile aren't necessarily that fragile. Here you got glass lenses. They didn't break. So he picked those back up, had new frames, and apparently wrote for some time after that, kind of looking through, if you will, the eyes of that accident. Fact number 7. King used part of the accident in his novel, The Dark Tower. Stephen King used the story of this whole tragic accident as inspiration for the final novel in the Dark Tower series. He created a character named Brian Smith, apparently modeled after the real man, but more reckless and dumb in the novel. Smith is driving while he's high, and he gets distracted again by a dog. Smith nearly strikes a character aptly named Stephen King.
Well, again, like I said, Stephen King put himself
right there in there. But instead, hits and kills another character who pushes King out of the way to safety. Now, conversations in the book are based on the exchange that took place between King and Smith while they were on the roadside that day waiting for medical help. Now, I can't imagine what kind of conversation you would have after somebody just flipped you over the van, knocked your glasses in the front seat, one that you're even conscious enough to be able to talk.
I don't know if you've ever seen Parks and Rec.
Yes.
There's there's an episode where Ron gets shot while hunting, and I imagine the conversation probably goes very similar. Well, you just shot me. Well, okay, but we need to do this. Yeah, I'll remember that when I forget that you shot me.
You shot me. Yeah, you ran over me. Number 8, the accident inspired King to start a charity foundation. Stephen King and his wife Tabitha are known philanthropists. They run the Stephen and Tabitha King Foundation, and they give very generously to other charity organizations as well. But after the accident, Stephen King gave $240,000 in charity funds to the rescue service and medical centers that helped him that day when he got hit on the side of the road. This was seen by some during Brian Smith's court case as a conflict of interest, strengthening King's influence in the town of Bangor, Maine. After the accident, King also created the Haven Foundation to help other writers, artists, and freelancers unable to work due to injury or illness. I mean, if you're going to take something tragic and put even a possible positive spin, I kudos. I think that's, I didn't say kujos either. I said kudos to that. Lastly, number 9, King's accident nearly ripped a town in half. Now, some of the residents of Bangor, Maine, Stephen King's, we'll call it primary residents, sided with the author after the accident, since they were aware of Brian Smith's reckless driving record and his apparent indifference at the scene of the accident. Now, others believed King was using this celebrity status to his advantage, and many of the letters were written to Bangor, Maine's daily newspaper, received in response to Smith's indictment through his treatment they considered was totally unfair. News director Charles Horn commented what a lot of people were saying was Brian Smith made the mistake of hitting a celebrity.
I would think no matter who you hit, if you hit somebody with a car and almost kill them, there's going to be repercussions. Now,
yeah,
admittedly, let's say, it's America.
Yeah.
Money talks.
America.
And I'm sure that Stephen King probably got, he was probably represented by a pretty cutthroat lawyer, and he had money to make sure.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that this Brian did not have the resources to fight back.
His only 2 friends were dogs, basically.
But again, if you hit someone and almost kill them, there's repercussions.
Touche. And I will say, perhaps that statement wasn't wrong, but in turn, maybe it took hitting a celebrity to get something done in this case and not covered up or flip under the rug or however you want to put it. So anyhow, again, I probably dove way too deep in that, but the more I dug, it was just, this is the type of stuff that happens to Stephen King. Well, again,
it's something he would have, it seems like something he might have written himself.
Yeah, it's like, did you make a pact with somebody, buddy? And did you write yourself into a novel that nearly got yourself killed? I don't know.
Well, you talked about On Writing. That was published in 2000. It was sort of a mix of a memoir and a writing style guide. Really good read, actually. If you're interested in King or you're interested in writing or you're someone like me who's interested in both, it's fantastic if you're interested in both. It's a nice glimpse into Stephen King and how he got where he was at that point. And, it just gives some good advice for writing if you want to write. I think the main thing is he tries to write 10 pages per day, I think. He's got a set goal. He tries to write X number of pages per day, with the idea being at the end of 3 months, you have a book.
Makes sense. Hadn't really ever thought about that.
So Stephen and Tabitha have 3 children together, Naomi, Rachel, Joe Hill, and Owen Phillip. Now, Joe Hill has become quite the author himself. He has a style, in my opinion, that's very reminiscent of Stephen King's, his father's. The movie Horns, if you've seen that is written by Joe Hill. There's a series called Nosferatu. That's also written by Joe Hill. He's kind of made a name for himself.
Nosferatu the vampire?
Actually, I think it's NOS 4A2.
Oh, okay.
And it is a vampire related story, but it's spelt weird.
Okay.
And like Eric said, Stephen and Tabitha provide scholarships for high school students, contribute to local and national charities. I found an article, and this is not my headline, it's an article that I liked, I read through. It was published by Esquire on May 21st, 2024. And it's just sort of some wisdom that Stephen King had accumulated over the years. And so I thought I would share. And these are quotes from Stephen King. Number 1, fame is a pain in the ass. Number 2, there's an old Spanish saying, God says, take what you want and pay for it. That's the case with being famous. And number 3, I knew a lot when I was 17, but since then it's been a constant process of attrition. I can agree with that. 4, if it's a good review, it can be dismissed. If it's a bad review, well, then that's something you obsess over a little bit.
Yeah.
The important thing about failing is that it should always be a learning experience. I agree with that. I think that's a good bit of advice. In every marriage, after the shine is off, then you get down to the serious work of building a relationship.
Yeah.
Yep. You can't let the sun go down on your anger. These all sound like effing platitudes. They become platitudes for a reason. It's just good advice. Be there for your kids. Say yes. Say yes as much as you can. What would I tell my 20-year-old self? Stay away from dope and stay away from booze because you have a tendency to go too far. And related to that, they say that you don't go to a whorehouse to listen to a piano player. And if you hang around the barbershop, sooner or later, you're going to get a haircut. Try to stay away from temptation. If you ask what I learned from my accident, it would be, number 1, stay on the sidewalk. I was walking in the country. and the guy came over the hill and hit me. Yep. I'd like to be known as somebody who died merry, who did his work as best he could and was decent to other people. And finally, I think what people will say is, this is the scary guy, the guy who wrote the horror novels. But I'd like to be known as somebody who was just a decent human being.
There you go.
To be fair, if you look at Stephen King, there's a picture of Stephen King when he was when working on the college paper. He looks like an absolute psychopath. He's got a full beard. He had very prominent buck teeth in that picture. He's got those thick rimmed glasses. He's got long hair that's just going every which way. He looks like a madman. Stephen King, of course, has toned down. One of my favorite Stephen King quotes actually comes from a movie. I rewatched it recently. Maximum Overdrive. Stephen King is in the movie. He's in most of the movies that are based on his works. So there's two. I'll cover the other one shortly. He goes up to an ATM to withdraw cash. Now, in Maximum Overdrive, all the machines in the world have gone mad. They've taken on an intelligence of their own. He goes to withdraw cash from the ATM, and the message on the ATM just says, "You're an asshole." It's one of my favorite Stephen King. He turns around and goes, "Honey, this machine just called me an asshole." That, and then in the movie It Chapter 2 that came out a few years ago, he plays a guy who owns an antique shop, and the writer character goes in. He's asking about a bike, and Steve, "Hey, ain't you that famous writer?" He goes, "Yeah." "Have you read my works?" He goes, "Yeah. I mean, they're okay, but your endings are terrible." And of course, the character is based on Stephen King, and
yes,
that is some criticism that King has received. So, I think at this point we might be ready for headlines.
Let's do it.
So my headline's pretty simple. We like our lists on Nightmares here. I have 10 times Stephen King's books cleverly reference his own stories and adaptations. This is from ScreenRant.com by Amanda Mullen, October 28th, 2024. Like we've mentioned, Stephen King's books are connected to one another. They reference each other. These are 10 clever references that you find in different books. Number 10, The Dark Tower turns Stephen King into a character. We've talked about that. Perhaps his best self-referential nod, King turns himself into a character in his own fictional universe. In The Song of Susanna, King is introduced as a writer and the creator of Roland Deschain, like we talked about, the gunslinger. And number 9, Dreamcatcher gives a nod to Pennywise and the Losers Club. Dreamcatcher it's an underrated book. I enjoyed it. It's sort of an alien invasion, body horror kind of thing, but it does contain a nod to it. At one point, Mr. Gray comes across a memorial for the Losers Club, which was the name the group of kids gave themselves. And someone has graffitied it with red paint, and it simply says, "Pennywise lives." Number 8, Stephen calls out the Shining movie in The Drawing of the Three. The second Dark Tower book references Stanley Kubrick's adaptation of The Shining through the character of Eddie Dean. When Eddie opens the western sea doors, he compares the view that he sees through Odetta's eyes to the moving point of view shots that exist in movies, much like The Shining. The Tommyknockers takes its Shining reference a step further. While in Bobby's workshop, Gardner notes that the key to the shed is nowhere to be found, then wonders if he should, quote, grab Bobby's axe and make like Jack Nicholson in The Shining.
Nice.
Number 6, Carrie is a book in the dead zone. When Patty Strachan claims Johnny lit a building on fire using his psychic powers, she says, "It's like in that book, Carrie." Number 5, Mr. Mercedes references the TV movie It. Mr. Mercedes sees retired Detective Bill Hodges trying to track down a killer. At one point, the killer dons a clown mask that looks a lot like Pennywise, as played by Tim Curry. Another character points this out, asking him, "You ever see that TV movie about the clown in the sewer?" Hodges admits that he hasn't, but upon watching it, he says, "Yeah, that disguise is very much like It." Number 4, Radar is compared to Cujo in Stephen King's fairy tale. Drawing a comparison to the titular Saint Bernard of Cujo, he compares the dog Radar to Cujo when first introduced. Number 3, Misery mentions the fate of the Overlook Hotel. I found this interesting. I haven't read Misery yet. But while talking about Andrew Pomeroy, Annie Wilkes states that he was headed to Sidewinder to sketch the remains of an old hotel. It later goes on to reveal that this hotel is in fact the Overlook, and that it was burned down having something to do with the caretaker, which in the story, Jack Torrance goes nuts and sets the boiler to explode. Number 2, Insomnia nods to Pennywise living in Derry's sewer system. Insomnia takes place in the fictional town of Derry, just like It, and there are numerous references to It throughout. One of the most subtle ones reminds the readers of Pennywise's use of the sewer system. When Ed's ring falls into the sewer grate, King writes, "In Derry, things that disappear into the sewer system have a way, an often unpleasant one, of turning up." And finally, number 1, Pet Cemetery reminds us that Jerusalem's lot isn't pleasant. And when Rachel Creed is on the road to Ludlow, she spots a sign for Jerusalem's lot, better known as Salem's Lot. And she notes that it's not a pleasant name for some reason. Of course, town overrun with vampires, not a very pleasant place to be.
Well, you all know me well enough to know by now I like to kind of shake things up a bit, do things a bit different. So for my headlines tonight, I decided to refer to several 2024 references related to the author, Stephen King. Well, I kind of dove into a little bit and I thought, well, you know, obviously a guy with this amount of fame and success, what is he worth money-wise? And I actually found some Fortune information online. In 2024, it's estimated that Stephen King is worth somewhere around $500 million. Now, his early challenges molded his path to become a literary luminary. King's literary catalog, you know, as we were talking about, now approaching or maybe over 70 novels.
70 books.
70 books. He's sold more than 400 million copies. I think Bill touched upon that globally. Screen adaptations, novels, graphic novels, comic books, video game. I mean, good Lord.
There is hardly a year that goes by that there's not a Stephen King movie or TV show.
Yeah. So how much does Stephen King make on every book title or sale? Well, again, this is kind of kept on the lowdown. It's not an exact science, but it is guesstimated Stephen King makes per book or has been paid in advances for publishing these books. And today it equates to about $1 to $3 for every book that's sold. Now, I'm not sure where they got the equation because it seems like there's some numbers of that formula that are missing, but they kind of tiptoe through the tulips, but they're saying, let's just say $2 for every book that's sold. You know, what book is considered King's most famous? It depends on what article you read.
I heard that the fans generally agree that The Stand is his best work. Now, as far as most famous, I would say it. That would be my opinion.
The Shining actually is listed as, again, depending on where you get your source, I found The Shining, 1977. Basically, literary critics and fans often say The Shining is one of King's best, most important novels. For many good reasons, but again, there's so many good ones. How do you pick?
And if you're only familiar with The Shining as a movie, the book is radically different than the movie.
Now, most famous quote, Bill had shared some of his quotes. Again, I love Stephen King's quotes. That's one thing I will take away from this podcast. He's witty. But one of the most famous quotes that I found online was, "Life is like a wheel. Sooner or later, it always comes around to where you started again. And people think that I must be a very strange person."
So as we drift into questions, you know, my questions are usually pretty tame.
Mm-hmm.
And I have here question, and then I marked it number 1.
Oh.
And it says, what was your first exposure to Stephen King and his works? But I thought, no. I don't like that question. And I'm going to ratchet it up for my good friend Eric. And I'm going to do him the way he does me.
Over the fire.
If you could be a character, now not a specific character, but if you yourself could be in any of Stephen King's books or movies or what have you, which one would you want to be in the most? And do you think you'd survive?
Most definitely, I would not survive. I am entirely too inquisitive, too stupid, too dumb, whatever you want to say. I would be going down the alleys, the hallways, wherever I shouldn't be. I really loved Misery. Now, again, I'm not a reader, so I'm going from the movie version.
Yeah.
I don't know how I would fit in with that. Maybe I'm the groundskeeper for the house where he's being kept against his will, and maybe I'm starting to see some of the things, hear him crying out, and see the bloody hammer where she's broken his legs, that kind of stuff. But I would probably get much too close, and I wouldn't survive.
You wouldn't make it.
I would not make it. But I really, to the first point of your question, where you. And I love the way you did that. That's very typical of the way I do you on your questions.
Yeah, that's how you do me.
Here's the question, and you start thinking about, nope, that's not it. That's not what I'm going to do. Misery was probably one of my first truly understanding that it was a Stephen King novel. Now, in all fairness and honesty, I later discovered Stephen King did some of the other things that I had read or watched, but I didn't realize it was Stephen King's work.
Well, and much like anything, I think the older I got, the more I started looking into Stephen King. Like I had seen Firestarter when I was a kid and didn't know.
I didn't know that was Stephen King. I'm showing my ignorance. But
yeah. So as I got older, there were definitely things. Creepshow. Like the first time I saw Creepshow, I didn't know that was a Stephen King thing. Of course, Stephen King's in it. But if you don't know who Stephen King is, I mean, that doesn't mean anything.
Well, then there seemed to be a period of time where you didn't really see a lot of images of the author, Stephen King. Yeah. So, I mean, that may have been during his drug time or whatever. But, yeah, you didn't really know what he looked like, or at least I didn't know what he looked like. But.
Stephen King pops up in the weirdest places, too. He's in an episode of Sons of Anarchy as a guy who disposes of bodies, which is a perfect role for Stephen King.
Yeah.
But it's like, what is Stephen King doing in Sons of Anarchy?
Yeah.
For me, I've thought about this one. And like if you know what, you got to go big or go home, right?
Sure.
The Mist. I think I would want to be a character in The Mist. Maybe not even necessarily one of those people trapped in the grocery store, but I love the story of The Mist so much. Again, like I said, I reread it immediately after I finished reading it the first time. I've read the story probably at least 6, 7, 8 times. I've seen the movie almost as many times. Had to see it in the theater. I've watched it with my kids. It's such a fascinating story to me. And I mean, if I'm going to get murdered, which let's face it, I'm not in the best of shape. I'm not out running a serial killer or a murderer dog or a killer clown. So if I'm going to get killed, at least have somebody say, oh, he was killed by a 6-foot lobster monstrosity or something.
I like it. The simplicity that he can tell those stories, though, and I know I have people out there that Bill's told me that, you know, I bring up Dungeons and Dragons way too much, but
I have heard that.
Yes, I know you have. And I respect that. I hear you, listeners. I hear you. But part of that is very true to a dungeon master. I think as a dungeon master, you can over-describe stuff. And it's better to kind of leave that up to imagination. And it is truly different for different people that's reading it or sitting around the table playing the game. In their mind, what they're seeing, but it still works to tell the story. He is an absolute master of that. And I would love to sit down and play Dungeons and Dragons with him. I don't know if he's even into that. But
here's the thing. Stephen King being who he is, like you would imagine that might be. But I could almost see Stephen King going, man, that's too nerdy for me.
That's nerdy. Yeah, I don't want no part of that.
I mean, he's part of a rock band for goodness sake.
True. So, Bill, out of the 70-plus current Stephen King books, writings, novels, what is your favorite book and what is your favorite movie and why? And you've kind of already answered, The Mist.
The Mist, for story, I would have to say The Mist. And again, it's because I'm a monster guy. I like monsters in my stories. And The Mist it's not one monster. It is fantastic, but it has Pennywise. You have one monster. The Mist has the weird flies and then the pterodactyl things and the tentacles and
like
the
a
mutant
whole
spiders
world of monsters.
And then you have the giant behemoth thing that walks across the road as they're, leaving. I think The Mist is fantastic. And again, the characters are believable. The main guy is just a guy trying to protect his kid and get his kid safe. And he's not only protecting him from the monsters, he's got to protect him from the people too. Stephen King, I think there's even a quote by Stephen King that says the monsters are real and they exist inside of us. And sometimes they win. So, I mean, just humanity is scary. So it works on two levels. It's not just the monsters, but it's the people. Now, as far as movies, books, I really got to say, like for Stephen King, I really got to lean into the Creep Show with the crate at the end. Some of those stories are the one where the meteor lands on his property and the goop's coming out of it.
Oh, yeah.
I remember he even touches it and I think meteor shit. And then he gets the grass on him. It's just, there's such weird imagery. And it's like, I watched it not that long ago with my kids. And of course, I think we've talked about this. My kids were like, Dad, this is kind of dumb. But I really liked it. And then The Raft, which I can't remember if that's Creep Show 1 or 2, but The Raft, they've got the floating thing out in the middle of the lake and then that oil slick that comes and grabs them and eats them.
Yeah, I do remember that. I think that's the second one.
It may be the second one. But absolutely those Stephen King's short stories are amazing. And that's basically what Creepshow is. It's just the short stories.
A whole bunch of short stories.
I love his short story work. In many cases, I mean, some of them I feel are better than a lot of the longer stories because, and again, I once read somewhere that a short story has to sell you the entire story in, just a handful of pages. But you don't you don't fill in a lot of the gaps. And Stephen King does tend to kind of meander in his writing, where he'll, they stopped at the farm, and then he'll tell you about like the farm. Like the farm people aren't even the main characters of the story, but you'll get their background.
You know everything about them before you leave. Yeah.
So the short stories are sort of like just quick and to the point. You know what I mean? So yeah, definitely the Creep Show. Creep Show 1 and 2. 2's not as good as the first one, but still the Wooden Indian story is really good in that one to me. So
all right. Well, for me, as I said, I am not an avid reader of novels. I will truthfully say, and I told Bill before we started the podcast, I have not read a single Stephen King book or novel. But I love the TV. I love the visual, movies and such. So I'm going to turn that question slightly for me, and I'm going to say, my favorite of the movies that's been taken from the books would be the remake of the 2013 Carrie. Really, really enjoyed that. I loved the first movie.
That's the one with Chloe Grace Moretz.
And I think Drew Barrymore was in
Drew Barrymore was Firestarter.
Firestarter, that's
Sissy
right. Sissy Spacek, yes.
I think John Travolta was in it as well. The original.
I liked the first one. I remember watching it. It was probably late 80s even when I watched that.
There was a 2022 version too. I was looking it up last night and saw that there were 3. There was the original, was it 1976? There was a 2002 version, and then there was the one you were talking about.
Yeah, the 2013, I don't know, it just really, I'm not a big remake person, but I thought they really did a good job of updating that, still keeping the story pretty pure, but, just kind of getting it to a newer generation.
I haven't seen it. The only nitpick I have about it is that Chloe Grace Moretz is far too pretty. The description,
not the geeky.
Well, the description
girl.
of the description of Carrie in the books, they describe her almost cow-like, not in her build. Like she wasn't skinny by any means, but she wasn't like grossly overweight.
Right.
But she just had that sort of blank, empty expression. And I think Chloe Grace Moretz,
a little bit above that. Yeah. Okay. And another one was the 2023 Pet Sematary Bloodlines.
And I haven't seen that one.
The remake.
I saw the Pet Sematary remake. I didn't see Bloodlines.
Yeah. Wife and I actually watched that not too long ago.
The prequel, isn't it?
Yes. It is the
I haven't
prequel,
seen
basically, so you understand what's going on there at the Pet Cemetery.
The one thing I think the Pet Sematary movies leave out is the fact that I guess and I haven't read Pet Sematary yet. I'm getting close. But I believe it's based on the Wendigo story, and I don't think they touch much on that in the movies.
Yeah. I think there's a little bit of touch on that in the Bloodlines.
Yeah, and there may be. I haven't seen it.
Because it's the prequel. I mean, so go back and tying some loose ends.
I will never forget, was his Fred Gwynn. Sometimes dead is better. I love that. I just in closing here real quick. This was sort of an indulgence, I will say, for me. This isn't, I know, our normal fare. But every now and then we do touch on, like I think the Blair Witch episode or when we did H.P. Lovecraft and Cthulhu. So if you bared with us and you made it this far, thank you. Again, I'm a huge Stephen King fan, and I've been reading Stephen King stuff. And again, just watched the new Salem's Lot not that long ago. And it was an episode I wanted to do, and I'm glad I got Eric semi on board with that.
You bet. We hope that you've all enjoyed, maybe learned a few things tonight on Stephen King, his life, his legacy, and his universe, the Stephen King universe.
The Stephen King Macroverse.
We do ask that if you have stuck with us, if you would like, comment, share, tell somebody if you enjoyed this or if you've liked some of our other episodes. Those little things really go a long ways to help us out and to build the channel. Thanks so much for listening. We appreciate each and every one of you.
Hey, real quick, call to action. I think Eric would agree. We'd like to grow this. Nightmares on the Lost Highway.
Absolutely.
If you could, if you're listening on Apple, if you would go and give us a review and rate us. If you have some feedback, that's fine too. Whatever platform you're listening, follow us, rate us, give us some reviews. That helps get some recognition and gets our name out there.
We do have a Facebook page, Nightmares on the Lost Highway. You can easily find us if you want to communicate with us. If you want to share some possibilities for future podcasts with us, reach out. We want to talk with you guys.
He continued writing during this time, hoping that a major paperback... Look, that was weird. I want to take a time to thank the people that helped
bring this all together. Alex Tudor, you can almost call him our producer at this point. Sarah Tudor, who also helps with some of the technical stuff. I want to take a moment to extend thanks to Eric for letting us use his space to record in, kind of our makeshift studio.
I, in turn, would like to thank Bill for, one, putting up with me and using this camaraderie to do something we both very much love and enjoy doing, and thank Bill's family for allowing him to spend all the time to work and clean up our recordings and present them in what you hear in the final terms, the final edition, if you will.
And I'd like to thank all of you for continuing to listen. I know we've got some loyal followers out there. We do this as a labor of love, but we're happy that there are people that enjoy it hopefully as much as we do.
Thank you very much.